Yeah, so I'm a marine ecologist, but I work on social ecological systems, so I'm interested in the links between the ecosystem and society and people. So social ecological systems are complex and holistic, and we're working in marine regions where even where we know relatively a lot about them, we're still very data limited. So I've mostly worked in European seas, and even though we know quite a lot about the North Sea or the Mediterranean Sea, there's still a lot of data gaps. So we have had to develop kind of approaches where we can work in these data poor environments and still kind of make decisions or recommendations about how to make management decisions. So just to kind of show where I'm working and the kind of context I'm working in. So maybe a lot of what we're kind of going to talk about during this workshop is sort of over here, sort of single pressures and single species or groups of species. And in this area, you can have these very quantitative models where you have a lot of data to support them. I'm kind of working more in this area. So it's very complex. We have to work with kind of qualitative or semi-quantitative types of information. And working in that kind of very broad area, we call it ecosystem-based management or the ecosystem approach. So this is just a diagram illustrating ecosystem-based management. So you have the governance context, which is kind of the context of the whole system, and we heard a bit about that this morning already. So it's kind of the legal obligations, the institutions that are there, and the stakeholders that are involved. So then you have the activities that are acting directly in the ecosystem, so things like fishing, aquaculture, shipping. They introduce pressures, so things like abrasion, marine litter, nutrient enrichment. These affect the ecosystem components. The ecosystem components generate ecosystem services. And then we have management options that are maybe a response to some change in the ecosystem or a response to something that happens in the governance system. And management options can act on the activities, such as regulating an activity like fishing. It can act on the pressures, so ocean cleanup is an example of something that's acting on a pressure. And it can act on the ecosystem components. So for example, restoring a habitat might be a management option that's acting on part of the ecosystem. So today I'm mainly focusing on these links between the activities, the pressures they introduce, how they affect the ecosystem components, and then how that goes on to affect the ecosystem services. And I'll just talk a little bit about the management options at the end. So this first part, so just the first part, activities to pressures to components, we call this an impact chain. And it's important to note that many different activities can introduce the same pressure, and also one activity can introduce multiple pressures, and these affect the ecosystem components. So that's relevant when it comes to thinking about how we manage them. And this is all of the impact chains for the North Sea, so you don't have to worry about the detail here, but it's the activities are on this side, so things like fishing, oil and gas, waste treatment. These are all the different pressures that are introduced, and these are the ecosystem components that these activities and pressures can interact with. So these pressures, this list of pressures and ecosystem components are derived from the EU Marine Strategy Framework Directive. So they're kind of coming from policy directives. And so this approach, and the approach I'm going to talk about now, is being used in Ireland as part of their implementation of the MSFD. So it's a useful approach for kind of EU marine regions or European regions, and it's feasible that it could also be applied in open ocean regions. And it's useful because it helps you to put into context. So you can put into context or perspective an activity like ocean cleanup relative to what else is going on in the system. It also helps you to put into context what's happening to a particular part of the ecosystem. So if we're particularly concerned with the Houston, we can look at how many pressures are being introduced to the Neuston, not only from an activity like ocean cleanup, but from any other activities that are occurring in that region. So in that way, we can think about cumulative pressures on particular parts of the ecosystem. So these, at the moment, it's just about identifying links wherever there is an interaction between an activity, a pressure, and a part of the ecosystem. So these are not weighted in any way, but we can weight them, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And they're based on expert judgment. So it's expert judgment coming from the literature or coming from other regions. So Rebecca mentioned that we could use the Sargasso Sea as a way to kind of fill in these links for a region that we don't know about, like the Great Pacific Gyre. So I've done a kind of very preliminary linkage framework for the open ocean region. So, I mean, as I said, this is filled in with expert judgments, and so far I've only done it myself, but it is something that needs kind of more input from several experts, not just one. So I haven't identified a very specific region, but that is something that would need to be done as well. But in general, I've identified 8 sectors, so things like fishing and shipping, and I've included ocean cleanup as one of those sectors. There's 28 different pressures being introduced, so they include things like extraction of flora and fauna, introduction of synthetic compounds. I've included 9 habitats, so ocean surface is one of them. And I've also included the deep sea, so the benthic deep sea, because I think if we're thinking about plastics degrading and sinking to the seabed, it is relevant to think about the deep sea, as that might be the ultimate fate of some of the plastics. And kind of 9 biotic groups, so things like, so broad biotic groups, things like whales, the zooplankton, that's where the Neuston would fit in, birds, phytoplankton. And the linkage framework can also be used to kind of just help think about where you are going to focus management. And you can pick out kind of individual impact chains, and it can just kind of help to indicate maybe the complexity of the situation. So I mentioned that management options can act on activities, pressures, or ecosystem components. So if we're thinking about the plastic litter in particular, where ocean cleanup is acting, if we were to think about alternative management options, we might want to think about the activities. And obviously that's extremely complex when it comes to plastic litter. You have to think not only about everything on land producing litter, but there's multiple sectors that are based in the sea that are also producing litter. And we think that maybe the litter is affecting all habitats and biotic groups. So as I mentioned, all of these links so far, I've just been talking about where we identify an interaction, and it's not weighted in any way. But we can weight it, and this is from some work that we've done previously. So every single impact chain, so every activity, pressure, ecosystem component interaction, can be assessed in a risk assessment approach, so an exposure consequence risk assessment approach. And this is broadly the same approach that has been used in the ocean cleanup environmental impact assessment, although it's been executed differently here. So in terms of exposure, we have different criteria to kind of determine what the exposure is, so the extent, so how much overlaps, how much the pressure disperses, how often it occurs, and how persistent the pressure is. And then the consequence, so how severe the consequence is on the ecosystem component. And so as exposure and consequence increases, you get an overall higher risk. And you can score each of these criteria so that you get an overall semi-quantitative impact risk score for each ecosystem component. And you can also get a score for how much risk a particular activity is introducing into the ecosystem as well. So I've just picked one impact chain that would come from ocean cleanup operations. So this is partly to kind of demonstrate how we do these scores, but also maybe to get feedback on whether I'm scoring it right, because I don't know exactly how it operates and things. So if we pick the particular operation of the plastic extraction part, so where the plastic, at the point where the plastic is getting removed, So the pressure that would be introduced there is the extraction of flora and fauna, because some of the zooplankton and phytoplankton will be removed. And then, so thinking particularly here on the Neuston. So again, I haven't defined a specific area, so you would need to do that, but I'm assuming that the extent would be widespread and even, so we kind of think about it over a 5-year period, and I'm assuming that because you intend to remove around 50% of the plastic, we usually categorize widespread even as covering kind of 50% of the area. So it's kind of thinking about where it's overlapping with the Neuston over a 5-year period. So you might agree with that or not. So in terms of dispersal, it's not a dispersing pressure. In terms of frequency of occurrence, I think it's probably rare, because I'm imagining in this area that you're maybe covering a large area but not the same area repeatedly. And then the persistence of the pressure is low, because once you stop doing it, the pressure stops. But the degree of the impact is acute, because the animals are being extracted and dying or whatever. So we can discuss that later, but that's kind of how you score the pressure assessment, how you score every single impact chain, and then you sort of get this cumulative effect of pressures when you're counting sort of every pressure that's coming from every activity. So I'm going to move on now to talk about the ecosystem component to ecosystem services part. Just in case some people aren't familiar with the term ecosystem services, broadly they're the nature's contributions to people. So there's 3 broad types. So the provisioning services, they're things like seafood, raw materials, genetic materials for bioprospecting. The regulation and maintenance services, they're things like waste treatment, habitat provision, climate regulation, flood protection. And then there's cultural services like recreation and leisure, scientific research, education, cultural heritage, and like Rebecca mentioned, the example of the earrings, so kind of artistic inspiration. And ecosystem services are generated by the by the process and functions of the ecological components. And then they lead to benefits and values to society. And the values might be monetary or non-monetary. And you can think about services in terms of the supply of services, which is on the ecosystem side, and the demand for services, which is in kind of the social side. And so I work mainly on the supply of services, and this part is important for thinking about kind of long-term sustainability. So there are services that the ecosystem can provide that aren't currently in demand, but they may be in demand in future. And you can also link the parts of the ecosystem with all of the services that they provide. So again, this is an example for the North Sea, where you have the ecosystem components on one side and the services on this side. And again, these links aren't weighted, but you can weight them as well to kind of show how important some components are for supplying different services. And this is from some previous work that I've done. So for European seas, on this side you have habitats. The blue bar here is the number of services supplied by each habitat. The purple bar is connectance, which is just a kind of simple index that is used in network analysis. So in this case, connectance is influenced by both the number of services that are supplied and also how many different biotic groups the habitat supports. So what you notice here is that as you move kind of further from the coast and deeper, you get fewer services supplied. But still, when you look at remote habitats like oceanic water, which is here, it's still supplying a lot of services. And even the very deep sea is also supplying many different services. So even these really remote habitats that are kind of further away from society and people are supplying and supporting different ecosystem services. So I've just done something similar for the Pacific oceanic habitats. So the way I've defined the habitats, I've put the ocean surface in as one habitat. I've done an upper photosynthetic pelagic habitat and a lower pelagic non-photosynthetic, and then I have different depths of benthic habitats. So that could be, this is preliminary again, so that's something that could be adjusted later if it needed to be. But the ocean surface is supporting most of the services from these kind of oceanic offshore habitats. So you can do the same for the biotic groups rather than the habitats. And in this case, the connectance is influenced by how many habitats the biotic group can exist in, as well as the number of services they supply. So even so we have the zooplankton here, which is kind of relevant for the Neuston. They're supplying lots of different types of services. They have lower connectance because they don't exist in as many types of habitats as something like fish. And again, for the oceanic biotic groups, so the zooplankton are here, and they're supplying as many different types of services as things like mammals and fish and turtles. So finally, I've done looked at the links from the ocean cleanup activity, all of the pressures they introduce, what ecosystem components they affect, and then through to looking at what ecosystem services might be impacted or where there's risk coming through to the ecosystem services just from ocean cleanup activities. So these bars are kind of the number of interactions. So every time there is a pressure interacting with an ecosystem component, that could go through to degrading an ecosystem service, there's a link. So there's 24 different services here. And the first thing to notice is that all of these services have lots of links, but they also are supplied by almost everything in the ecosystem. So part of the reason why they have a very high number of links is because everything supplies them, so there's lots of links. But I've highlighted this service because, I haven't weighted these at all, but if I was to weight kind of the importance of different services in this system, I would have said that kind of maintaining nursery populations and habitats for commercially important or migratory species would be one of the most important services supplied by these habitats. And there are a lot of links, so there's a lot of pressures being introduced from the activity that's going to impact this service. But I would say that what I haven't shown here is the kind of benefits to services that ocean cleanup would introduce from removing plastics. So plastics are obviously also going to impact ecosystem services, and I haven't shown that here. So finally, I'm just going to say quickly something about management options and kind of in the kind of ecosystem approach or ecosystem-based management, how we kind of make trade-offs and assess different management options. So there's different criteria that you can use to assess management options, but there's three main ones that we use. Feasibility, first of all, that's in terms of kind of governance, institutional and social setting. The effectiveness, so in terms of the ecological effectiveness, so that's achieving your objectives. So I've kind of considered the objective as how we improve ecosystem health overall, but you might have different objectives, different ecological objectives. And then the efficiency is in terms of the economic efficiency. And I've just considered three management options just to really demonstrate the approach. So the first one is business as usual, so do nothing, and that's kind of our baseline. The second is ocean cleanup operations, so so this is the management option that focuses on the pressure. And then I've just come up with one alternative one, so prevent plastic from entering the sea, but I wanted to do one that's focusing on the activities. So I'm not considering the ocean cleanup preventing plastic entering the sea. I'm focusing on what if you were to try and manage the activities that introduce plastic. So then you go through each management option and just think about them in terms of these different criteria. So here I've just done kind of a qualitative statement without thinking through too deeply, but this is kind of where all the more detailed knowledge and models and things would fit into under these different criteria. So in general, business as usual, there'd be quite high feasibility. The only things that might mean that someone would have to do something would be maybe some sort of social pressure or kind of future legislation that would require some sort of cleanup of the open ocean. So in terms of effectiveness, it's probably low because you will just have increasing and accumulating plastics on the wider environment. And in terms of efficiency, in terms of implementation, it's efficient, but you'll get loss and degradation of ecosystem services as a result of increasing plastic or litter pollution. For ocean cleanup, it's high feasibility, so we had more discussion on that earlier. The effectiveness is kind of related to the trade-off between the negative impacts on the ocean surface habitat in particular, which can be acute in at least some of the cases, with the positive impacts to the wider environment from removing plastic. And so as we've discussed, there are some effects of plastic that are considered acute, like entanglement, but I think in general we think of plastic as being a sort of chronic pressure in the environment. And also we would need to think about whether it's a long-term solution. So if there are these kind of negative impacts happening, they're maybe going to build up over time. And then efficiency, so I think because it's self-funded, it's efficient, but you get gains related to some ecosystem services from removing the plastic, but you are getting loss or kind of degradation of others. And then, so the alternative one then, so preventing plastic entering the sea by targeting the activities is probably quite obviously very unfeasible because it would require such massive coordination between different sectors on sea and on land and different regions and probably behavioural change. It's probably the most effective solution, although ecologically, although it won't remove what's already in the sea. And it's probably very expensive to implement because it would result in losses to sectors, but you would get gains in ecosystem services that would otherwise be lost. And then you can kind of just summarize those three criteria, look at them together. You might not agree with the way I've color-coded this, but it's just the way of kind of trading off different options against each other. So so we've kind of talked about trade-offs and things, and one way to approach the trade-off situation is to try and think about what the alternative options are and try and just compare them against each other, and hopefully fill in these boxes with more detailed modelling and kind of more detailed knowledge and research. So that's it. Thank you. Yeah, you tend to get just more ecosystem services in coastal areas, partly because of they're just closer in contact to people. So, and with ecosystem services, you kind of need that interaction with people for a lot of them. You also get more ecosystem services where you have anything that photosynthesizes, because there's a whole lot of extra services that require photosynthesis in particular. So that's why you kind of also get slightly more services on the ocean surface than in kind of the deeper ocean. And the kind of offshore services you get tend to be mostly the regulating and maintenance services, and some of the kind of cultural services. But you would get maybe more unique things like genetic materials for bioprospecting and things like that. Yeah.
Thanks for the interesting presentation. Could you please go back to the previous slide? I do have a question related. Like here, what is the efficiency gain? I think I was kind of like lost.
The efficiency is related to the economic efficiency. So kind of it might relate to how much it would actually cost to implement a management measure but it also relates to losses and gains in terms of ecosystem services.
Okay, so is it related to the benefit, the societal benefit of the activities? Or is it only the cost? Because my question is, for instance, I'm not familiar with the research, so I would argue that it can't be like the same color or the same impact for all of them. And I would, for instance, say, and again, I'm not even again familiar with what Oceanic Cleanup is going to do, but if the standard tools or the Deloitte's report are correct, and we are talking about something like, I have a figure, the social cost of plastic is something like 139 billion per year. If we remove like 1% of that, we're talking about $1 billion. Is the life of the Newton or the whatever it is you had in there valued at 1 billion? Because if the cost benefit analysis says that's okay, I mean, we should do it because
they're very pretty. They're very pretty.
Yeah, I mean it's a good question because, and it's kind of a wider debate than maybe just here. It's a wider debate when it comes to considering ecosystem services because some services have monetary value, others don't. So something like the well-being you feel when you're by the seaside or something doesn't have a monetary value, but it has a value to society or to individuals. Certainly when you talk to some kind of policy people or governments, they are really only interested in the actual monetary value and costs. But I mean, I personally try to take a wider perspective of the kind of the wider costs and benefits, not just the monetary value.
Do you think the efficiency is the same for
well, I mean, this is very coarse kind of scale here, but it's maybe not the same, or it's maybe the same, but for different reasons. It might not be the same. I haven't, done this in detail. I haven't. I mean, for example, I wasn't aware of the Deloitte report before I did this.
Okay, so this benefit part, I think, might be interesting.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
And economies, they play it's the monetary value in everything.
Yeah.
There is like values on like dolphins.
Yeah.
So if they
but they
eat plastic,
they do put a value on all those things, but they probably undervalue them because they still only consider the monetary value.
I think policymakers they care about we need to perform cost benefit analysis.
Yeah.
Because that's probably what they are doing to prove that there is a societal benefit on what we are doing. And if, for instance, cleaning up the oceans has net benefit, then it's something that we should implement. Because there are I'll tell you, for instance, an example. In the shipping industry, we do have some regulations right now. There is a convention, the Ballast Water Management Convention. We kill a lot of microorganisms. Because we have to. So I think the regulators actually agree that we can kill microorganisms if there is a benefit to the society.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that I know it's very hard to do because you need to place. You need to place on a common scale, and that's usually money.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess we should do this also if we're talking about efficiency.
Yeah, well, I mean, the cost-benefit analysis fits within efficiency, but I'm not an economist, so I can't do the cost-benefit analysis.
You're familiar with the valuation of the whole of the Earth's ecosystems. The ecological economists put a number on the value of all the world's ecosystems. Yeah, well, in other words, how much would you pay to preserve the entirety of the ecosystem? As if you could just sell it off and buy plots on Mars. It's quite preposterous, right? I don't think it's at all clear that we should be making decisions based on the cost-benefit analysis. Because after all, those create ridiculous outcomes sometimes. Don't you think?
The argument is
Open question.
The argument is it's not zero, isn't it? All the time it's just arguing, so the figure they come up with is absolutely wrong.
Of course, if it's not infinite, for the cost of the ability to live on the planet, if that cost isn't infinite, I don't know what values even mean.
Yeah.
And at the same time, back in the day when we were worried about acid rain, you're all too young to remember such a thing. But acid rain used to be the crisis that we had before global climate change. By the way, all those acid rain people turned into global climate people. And at the time, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the senator from New York, famously said, when discussing the witness about whether it was reasonable to spend all this money to forestall global, or to stop the acid rain, he said, for the amount of money you're suggesting we spend, I could buy fish for all my constituents for the whole year. We're saving some fish for this money. It's not clear that makes sense, but it's not the fish. It's not the money that we get from the fish that's at stake, right? It's the
Sorry, expecting an answer from me, I can just say that in the US, and like European citizen, in the US they do have a regulation, and all policy options they have to go through, and as we also do the UN environmental impact assessment, but they have to go through a cost-benefit analysis.
That's a Reagan era.
It might be stupid or not, but for instance, the reason that we have seatbelts is because it has proven that it saves lives. So they've done a cost-benefit analysis. A lot of policy options are based on that. So I think it should be based on that as well. I mean, a lot of things, at least I need some evidence that, because we have the trade-off. And if you ask, for instance, in the discussion, what's the trade-off between the carbon dioxide emissions and what is that, of collecting plastics and the benefits. So I'm expecting to see something related to what's the cost and the benefit of cleaning up the oceans, and what is the cost and the benefit of killing the other microorganisms. So that's the only way that we can see the trade-off.
I disagree that it's the only way.
Well, I think that the other thing to sort of keep in mind is what are the potential costs hiding in the uncertainty, right? So it's this is part of why the U.S. has the Food and Drug Administration, because drugs were prescribed to everybody in Europe and the U.S. for a while, right? And then there was a particular drug, thalidomide, that was prescribed to everybody that then had very severe consequences. And because the United States was more cautious, that particular crisis didn't impact the U.S. as much as other places. So I think when you do a cost-benefit analysis, I know maybe I'm speaking to the choir in terms of uncertainty, but it's hard to put a value on what that uncertainty is. And when you talk about something like health, I think it becomes much more clear, that the uncertainty of what the negative impacts could be is quite serious.
I believe that New York has better air quality than most Europeans, because EU went diesel for the climate. The US is mostly petrol, isn't it? So we go to diesel.
Oh, I can tell you it's compared. And plus all our rivers. Right.
So, can I ask a question, or are we running out of time?
I don't think we're running out of time, but I'm not sure if there's coffee. There might be coffee. No one seems to know.
Okay.
No one seems to know if there's coffee. There's coffee in the seminar room. So, Simon, he's the smart one and also the one who actually works.
So you suggesting a short break for next time?
Perhaps, yes. Are there burning questions?
Yeah, no, I was just curious as scientists, in terms of the effectiveness question mark, what can we do to help provide the information necessary to turn that question mark into a color?
Well, I think just what you've been talking about during your own presentation, we could also kind of do this weighted risk assessment as a kind of data poor sort of approach to answering the question. But different types of information can feed in there, and then it's just kind of there'll obviously be a certain amount of uncertainty associated with it.